Hello and welcome everybody to Budget Night, or as the economist Chris Richardson said, us sad losers that are uniting over the data and all of the speculation about what's going to happen in this year's budget, with Mr. Chalmers throwing down his third budget. I'm joined by some wonderful heavy hitters in my midst. I'm going to go clockwise around my screen, starting with Cate Bakos from Cate Bakos Property, buyer's agent to the stars. Good evening.
Good to see you, Mr. Mortlock.
Of course, we've got Pete Wargent from Time Zones Unknown, from Alan Wargent, our favourite finance and economics commentator. Welcome back. You had a year off, but it's nice to see you again.
Did I? I think you're right. I might have missed last year. I was probably stuck overseas somewhere with all the border closures. So yeah, great to be back. Always a good fun night.
I think you might have been on holidays in Coffs Harbour, if memory serves.
I think you were actually.
You're on that magic carpet slide, getting selfies in front of the big banana. But thankfully, you've realised that budget night's more important this year.
You know what? That is actually true. You've got a better memory than I do. You're right. I was with the kids at the big banana. So there you go.
He was sending us messages though. Couldn't miss out.
Yeah, we were putting some of your comments in the comments live for people, so that was helpful. You were sort of our correspondent live on the ground in Coffs Harbour, taking the pulse of the nation in that little microcosm. And we're also joined again this year with Jeremy Iannuzzelli, whose name I can now, I think, comfortably pronounce, accountant par excellence and partner at KHI Partners. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thank you, Mike. Good to see everyone back, and looking forward to what tonight brings. Be good fun, and always happy to see what they're going to do to tackle the buzzword of inflation and make sure that our rates come down instead of go up.
And that is probably a good way to start our pre-budget analysis. If we're quoting Chalmers himself, he said, don't expect a cash splash. And that's kind of the tightrope that we're walking here, right, guys? Because cost of living pressures are a real thing, but we can't just be throwing cash around, because keeping this inflation at bay is the real issue. And Pete, there's some commentary from Treasury to say that we could be sub 3% inflation by the end of this year. That sounds a bit fanciful when you consider what the RBA's rhetoric is about it. Are they just being a little bit more, fun police, and the Treasury's a bit more on the money, do you think?
So every budget needs a good theme. And if you remember a couple of years ago, it was 1 million new homes in 5 years. The themes this year are going to be the inflation war will be won by Christmas. And we'll talk a bit about how they're going to get there, because as you said, the RBA isn't expecting inflation to hit 3% until late 2025. And the second key theme is a bit like, you remember the old Oprah Winfrey clip where you get a car. There's going to be a bit of that. Everyone gets a car sort of thing. So there's two ways they'll get inflation down at the headline level. One is every household will receive cost of living relief on power bills. And then the second way is an increase in the Commonwealth rent assistance. So now that mechanically reduces headline inflation. Now the skeptics will say, yeah, great, but won't this free up more household spending elsewhere and keep underlying inflation higher than it might otherwise have been? And look, they might well be right. So it's a bit of a gamble. But anyway, that's what they're going to show in the budget papers, is inflation by Christmas back under 3%. So whether or not it actually happens, that's a different question.
And Alan Kohler said that Chalmers has essentially been kissed on the backside by a rainbow this year, because when we look at the mid-budget estimates, they were actually predicting a budget deficit, but this is actually going to be the first back-to-back surplus since 07-08. Is that really just coming down to underestimating commodity prices and, of course, factoring in a higher unemployment rate, which means there's less on welfare and there's more revenue from personal taxation?
Yeah, when you look at it, it's almost all to do with iron ore price forecast. So, as you mentioned, in the previous budget, very, very conservative assumption for iron ore prices, and of course they've ended up higher. So Yeah, it's like a surprise, but it's not really a surprise. So deliberately conservative forecasting of iron ore, basically. And also, as you said, the unemployment rate has been under 4%. We've been a multi-decade low. So we should be running much bigger surpluses than we actually are. So we're going to surplus for this year, but then just a sea of red ink into the future because the structural spending is still very high. And this is a Labour budget, right? So there's going to be cash splashed around all over the place and pork barreling and jobs for the boys because there's an election coming up within the next 12 months. So, yeah, we will get a surplus reported, but actually, all things considered, we should actually be running much bigger surplus than they are. So, yeah, but the budget surplus has really come about because the forecasts were pretty conservative on iron ore prices.
And Jeremy, there's a couple of things that I wanted to talk to you about. One is small business. In everything that's been leaked, all we can really see is the instant asset write-off will continue. That kind of seems to be a perennial easy thing for them to say. Look, if you buy an asset under 20 grand and you've got under 10 mil of revenue, you can expense it straight away. There's nothing else that we can see that's been leaked for small business. And of course, a couple of things that I wanted to touch on with you about is the HEX indexation and the stage 3 tax cuts, where the Oprah Winfrey stuff is you get a tax cut, but the top end of town have had that kind of a little haircut on their tax saving, right?
Yeah, well, the students have won that war, I suppose, with the government. Now, rather than HEX being indexed at 7.1% pegged, it's now going to be taken at the lower of the CPI or the wage price index. So roughly about 3.2%. And everybody who paid a nasty indexation of 7.1% in June of 2023, it's going to get a bit of a rebate back. So there's a bit of a win there for students. Stage 3 tax cuts, as we all know, they got revoked and changed. And I feel that it went well under the radar. Years and years ago, this would have been, bigger than Ben-Hur, backflipping on such aggressive tax cuts the Liberal government brought in, but they got it through quite sneakily without a lot of headlines. So I suppose adding to what we spoke about, inflation and mining tickets coming through from a dollar sign, there's been a lot of bracket creep. I get to see the very micro level clients doing quite well, and many of my clients' incomes have gone into now the next tax bracket, and that's only adding to further cash in the coffers for the government. But how sustainable is it long term? And it comes back to what Pete says, it could be a bit of red to come in the years forward.
I think, I really think that the government of the day loves bracket creep because it's a way to increase taxes without announcing, well, we're going to increase taxes. And it sneaks under the media radar and doesn't get much scrutiny. But you're seeing it's really biting with some of your clients?
Absolutely, yeah. A lot of people now are focusing on ways they can reduce their taxable income to obviously make their dollars work harder for them. So superannuation is key, and I'm hoping there's going to be no material discussions around superannuation thresholds. I know they have increased it, which has been a while coming, but I hope they don't touch super too much. It's always a bit of a no-no before any election, but we'll see what they do to the caps involved for pension phase members. So that's interesting to see, just a little, as I said, the devil in the detail type of information that they release, the subliminal messages between the sentences of hip hip hooray.
Yeah, and I think this is really, as Pete mentioned, the federal election's likely to be before this time next year, so it's always that sort of tricky little balances. You want to have a little bit of fun for people, but of course we've got the inflation issue, and it is all about winning that election. One thing is noticeably missing, and that is an answer to the housing issues that we have. I mean, Cate, we've got some stimulus to housing markets in and around, huge increase in GDP. As a percent of GDP, the defence spending, they're looking to get up to 2.4% over the next 10 years. There's also a number of big infrastructure projects, which interestingly are pulling construction workers away from building the homes that we need. Western Sydney, we've got, the Inland Rail, which, Jeremy loves to look at the numbers on that one. You know, we've got an announcement for the Sunshine Coast rail and, you know, a bunch of smaller projects in Canberra and that sort of thing. Is there anything that stands out to you that's fundamentally going to shift property on the back of this?
Look, there's actually talk about introducing more skilled workers into the construction market, and I think that could be, it could certainly ease our burden that we're facing right now if we had more skilled workers arriving and able to reduce the cost of construction. I know that obviously we've got a materials shortage and hiked prices there, but a large part of it all is labour. So that will be interesting. And I know that we were talking off air about how how some of the locals feel about that, and particularly the help me out, Mike.
Yep.
No?
So they've announced that there's going to be 15,000 fee-free places in the construction sector. We've also, had a huge increase in international migration, but a lot of that doesn't seem to have flown its way into the construction sectors because of some union influences. Now, I don't want to I don't want to have a horse's head on my car or a flower under my pillow or whatever, Jeremy's Italian mafia mates do. But I mean, that is a concern, right?
Yeah, it is indeed. But, back to the infrastructure projects that we were chatting about, there's quite a bit of money flowing around there. You mentioned the Brisbane to Sunshine Coast rail link, the Sydney to Newcastle. Canberra's got a light rail. I know down in my hometown in Melbourne, we've got a lot going on here, and all of the pain that we've been through for the last 5 years with the metro rail link is going to come to a head, and we'll start to benefit from that. And I think, places like Melbourne that have had questionable commute times and not so enjoyable rail services, that will really change and make a big difference for the locals. But I think the big one is all about the pressure on construction. And I maintain that if we do get new arrivals who are skilled workers, that really could ease the pain. And we will see a difference unfold in people's preferences in the housing market. At the moment, it's two-speed. If it's renovated, it flies. If it's not renovated, it doesn't. I think that we'll start to ease that burden as well.
That is a funny thing with the construction cost issue that we've had, which is moderated from a materials point of view, but labour is an issue. People aren't taking on those renovation projects like they were, or at least they're much more expensive, so it's easier to buy something that's done. We've got a comment from Catherine Cashmore, who's an economist herself, and she's blaming Dan. I mean, Dan did lock her in her St Kilda apartment for a good 200 and something odd days, so she's bound to be upset about that. But the infrastructure spending, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that, guys, because inflation is an issue, and we've got a huge pipeline of government projects. Now, of course, Cate, that feeds into efficiency. If people are stuck commuting, there's a cost to that. But it begs the question, is the timing right to be announcing any major projects, or are we just really sticking with what we've already had in the pipeline?
I think a lot of people want to see what they've committed to get finished. Australians and Victorians have had a gutful of seeing projects get shelved and then money being sloshed around and projects paid out, and then you're back to day one. So the first thing I'll say is what they've committed to, they should be finishing. But we've got huge population growth, and if you sit in traffic even just one day a week and feel the pressure of that, you will welcome some of this investment in infrastructure. I think most commuters would say that.
Now, we are going to cross live to Treasurer Chalmers in around about 12 minutes. But in the meantime, if you've got any questions for my intelligent and good-looking panel of experts, please put them in the chat like Catherine did. Jeremy, one thing that stood out to me is there's an announcement for a project which is the high-speed rail between Sydney and Newcastle. That's a project close to my heart. But what they've announced is $7.8 million for the business case for light rail. Nothing to do with building it, but the business case. So it's good to see that your accounting mates at PwC are probably going to get some more government contracts.
Well, they've lost probably $1 billion between them over the whole ATO debacle and sharing of international tax law. So, as Pete said, it is a Labor budget, and there's always a bit of a job there for the boys taking care of the top end of town. But look, a lot of these business cases that they're doing, as we all know, is red tape and bureaucracy. A reason to blame someone else if it doesn't go ahead, or a reason to blame someone if it becomes over budget. But as Cate mentioned, we've seen huge blowouts and lots of backtracking, and lots of companies, especially overseas entities, being paid out before a shovel hits the ground. So it's been chaotic the last probably 8 to 10 years, and probably to add a bit of fuel to the fire, and I'll make a comment which many people might not like, but for probably 40 years, we've been well behind our infrastructure spending. We're very much late into the 5G and very much late into the optic cable and fibre network. We haven't built any new dams, and we're closing more power plants than we are building more power plants to cater for a growing population. So
you're probably going to get some more government contracts.
Oh, we just had a little echo there. That's the member for Yarraville. You've been warned.
So yeah, it's going to be a challenging one, but they need to keep up with infrastructure, because if you're going to keep migration levels strong, to keep a very strong economy, you need to have the infrastructure to support it.
And I suppose, Pete, from maybe a national security point of view or an investment point of view, there's a lot that we're likely to see about domestic manufacturing. I remember as a student, Australia was considered one of the global elites when it came to solar panels, for example. We had quite a lot of intellectual property and capacity there. That seems to have all disappeared. But, things like solar, things like hydrogen. There's even an announcement in the budget, I believe, on quantum computing. Where does that sort of sit for you in terms of strategy for Australia? Is it a protection piece or is it an investment piece?
So my top tip for tonight: every time you hear the phrase "future made in Australia," take a drink, and then by 7:45 you'll have finished the whole slab of Tui's New, most likely. So that's going to be one of the key slogans. Yeah, as you mentioned, subsidies for solar, defence, hydrogen, domestic manufacturing. Look, I mean, this is an ideology thing. We've spent the last few decades moving away from subsidising unprofitable industries. We had all of that stuff for years and years in Elizabeth and the car auto production down in Melbourne. Do we prop up these industries to let them fail? So in a sense, turning the clock back here, I suppose the argument will be from Labour's side of politics is that, geopolitical tensions being what they are, it's the future security for the country. So but there'll be a lot of talk about future made in Australia. I think that'll be one of the key themes they want to get across. I think, as you mentioned, they'll talk up all the other things like stage 3 tax cuts, instant asset write-offs and things like that, which we kind of knew about in advance. But I think, one of the messages Chalmers will want to get across will be on the future made in Australia. So, I guess, and also, as you mentioned, because this government seems to be so slavishly following Bidenomics for whatever reason, HECS debt relief and pretty much whatever Joe Biden's been doing, but we're doing it 6 or 12 months down the track. So, we'll see what comes out.
As long as we're not doing what New Zealand's doing, that we're up to a good start. We've got another question from Catherine. She's put us to the good-looking one, which it's difficult to know which direction she's going in there. I mean, I'm probably not going to ask her preferences live on budget night. But a question perhaps we'll put to the whole good-looking panel. Infrastructure Australia has warned about a shortage of construction materials and labour to meet existing infrastructure requirements. Even if it's announced, can we do it? To sort of preface that question, the announcement of the 1.2 million homes over a 5-year period, that's due to start 1 July. Essentially, we're asking the construction sector to not only do something that we've only ever done once, but to do it 5 consecutive years in a row where there is an extreme labour shortage, where we've lost around about 3,000 construction companies last financial year, and we're about 1,400 odd this financial year. Materials have moderated. The impacts from the pandemic have kind of gone, but the labour kind of the Labor issue remains. And when politicians say we're going to build 1.2 million homes, presumably they're talking about builders and developers, not the actual government. Jeremy, I'll start with you. Can we do it?
Look, it'll be a big struggle if they can. It'll be a big feat and a big hill that they can put their flag on. But I don't think we've got the people, and I don't think we've got the skills. I've got lots of clients who are still waiting months and months in Cate's neck of the town down in Victoria, and I think by memory I've heard that's probably been the hardest hit in terms of builders and skilled labour. So it'll be very tough. There's a lot of people, a lot of houses, and we've been falling short of the peg for many years.
And Pete, the Master Builders Association have issued a little bit of a graph about where we are now and where we need to be. They're predicting in one of those 5 years to build more than 250,000 homes, but only one, and there's quite a gap there. Obviously, the elephant in the room is with such high international migration, do we have enough homes to support this new workforce that we kind of need to keep, anecdotally, the cafes and the restaurants open where they can't actually find people to take those jobs?
Yeah, it's a bit chicken and egg, isn't it? There's definitely a tension between the strong infrastructure spending that we need and the housing supply that we need. But yeah, look, I'll take the contrarian view. I actually reckon Australia can do this over the next 5 years. I think at the moment, it feels like everything's very slow, but once property prices rise, then people will start building. I think there's 4 things that will get mentioned in the budget. 11 billion to be made available for streamlining of housing construction over 5 years. It sounds like a lot, but it's really not. Secondly, you already mentioned fast tracking of skilled construction and trades workers. Thirdly, there'll be probably, I don't know, but there'll probably be more texture around build to rent, which is basically going to be withholding tax reduction for foreign investors, accelerated capital works deduction. So that's to get foreign developers to come and build to rent projects in Australia. And then fourthly, it'll be very interesting to see what they put in the footnotes for net overseas migration. Last year, they forecast 400,000. They massively undercooked it. I think there's a lot of pressure on trying to reduce international student numbers. But if they can get population growth back down to a more normal level, then I think, I wouldn't be surprised, if in 5 years' time we're not talking about housing shortages. It's just the way the cycles go. Every shortage is followed by a glut, and every glut a shortage. Yeah, so I know that's a very contrarian view at the moment because everybody's got a downer on labour and housing targets, but these things can change pretty quickly.
No, that's an interesting point. And Cate, I want to throw to you before we get warmed up for Mr. Chalmers. If you think back to, say, your neck of the woods in and around Melbourne CBD, there was a huge increase in apartment construction. We're talking, what would that have been, 2018, 19, 20, thereabouts. Yeah, and we know that the pipeline of high density residential is down on its long-term trend. And that sort of seems to be the quick and easy way to build homes. They might not be purposely or fit for purpose or exactly what we want, but that pipeline is down. What are you feeling on the ground in Melbourne?
Look, we've had an oversupply for quite a while, and we are seeing that get soaked up. There's no doubt about it. And, I'll also mention, and we've said it before, with all of the infrastructure projects going around, getting a builder has been really hard work, and they're paid pretty seriously on high-rise projects. But, for anyone, mums and dads wanting to do extensions and renovations, it's easier to sell a house and buy another one. But, in terms of what I'm seeing on the ground, we haven't had really strong pressure on unit prices and apartment prices yet, which signals that we're still not soaking up the volume that we've got. I don't think that, we're at a stage where we'd say we're at capacity. I think there's still a bit of an excess. But if we don't have more starts, I think that will start to bite, and we will start to see our house prices and our apartment prices closing that gap a little bit. And it's been something that many people have spoken about for various reasons. But I also think that getting closer to having a shortage of units will see that take place.
Jeremy, everything that I see as being leaked and the housing starts statistics says to me that there's upward pressure on rents and upward pressure on house prices. Do you expect anything to be announced that likely heads in the direction of a moderating in price growth? I mean, we really need to see what Pete's talking about, I assume, and that's a point where these construction projects really start to stack for there to be any heat coming out of that.
Yeah, I think, look, underlying, just looking at clients, I believe the true inflation underlying real number is much more than what's being quoted publicly. Number one, I can see the prices increase. I'm seeing revenue increase for many people not working much harder than they were a year ago. But I feel without interest rates coming down, it's not going to bring up the appetite and feed these developers to continuing to build. Just recently, last week, Harry Triguboff said that at the moment, it's not becoming feasible for him to continue to build apartments in New South Wales. The red tape, the bureaucracy, and the cost attached to it is just far too great. So interest rates really do have to start coming down to feed a little bit more, I would say, prospect in the new home build market. At the moment, already established homes going off the shelf. I've got clients buying dozens and dozens a week. It's just amazing to see how much money still is running around in the system and how cashed up people still are, even in these higher interest rate environments. The disparity between the people that have and have not is becoming much larger, as they say with the saying, inflation feeds wealth, and creates a bigger divide between the people that have and have not.
Yeah, and that's an interesting one to observe for me, Pete, is that it seems to be the media noise, the story is all about cost of living pressures, but there are data points where we're seeing spending, still galloping along. Some recent data that talked about the increasing in spending from renters to those with a principal place of residence with a mortgage to those that are unencumbered that own their own home, 4%, 6%, 8% rise. I think that was in the data. Is it a bit of a two-speed economy when it comes to, this cost of living pressure? There's a lot of people that doesn't seem to be biting, and it's regulating that expenditure that's the trouble for policymakers.
Yeah, look, it definitely is. I think we've seen an enormous snapback in migration since 2021 and onwards. So, I think if you look at it, though, household spending per capita, obviously household spending is increased, but per capita, and if you adjust for the fact, if you take off inflation, then actually it's been going backwards for some time. But there's definitely a two-speed thing there. I mean, look, Jeremy was talking about client experience. There's a lot of people in recent months who've suddenly found that their mortgage repayments have doubled. So there's a lot of talk about interest rates aren't working. Yeah, let's see. I wouldn't be at all surprised if retail is in a recession for the next 12 months, just because of that. Volumes are already falling. And a lot of people are seeing their mortgage rates reset from 2% to 6% or sometimes even higher. And that's not just a one-time event. That's every single month they've got to find that extra cash. So, look, there's definitely some people in a much better situation than others, mostly people who paid off their mortgage and baby boomers. But, I think it's a bit of a gamble what we're seeing today, trying to mechanically reduce headline inflation. But I actually think it's probably a smart gamble because it allows interest rates another... where are we today? May, but another 6 months, I suppose. The whole idea behind this budget is, can they get an interest rate cut before the next election? That's the whole thing. Like, if they can get that, they'll probably win the next election. If people are still paying the same mortgage rates in May 2025, well, they might be a bit pissed off and there could be a few votes going the other way.
That'll be a failure. Anyway, it's time to head over to Parliament. Bear with me. This is a low budget operation, so there's almost certainly going to be some technical errors, but we'll go to Jim and we'll see what we can do, and we'll see you guys on the other side.
I have received a message from His Excellency the Governor-General recommending, in accordance with Section 56 of the Constitution, an appropriation for the purposes of the Appropriation Bill No. 1, 2024 to 2025, I call the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I present the Appropriation Bill number 1, 2024-25 and the explanatory memorandum.
And I call the Clerk.
First reading, a bill for an act to appropriate money out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund for expenditure out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund for the ordinary annual services of the government and for related purposes.
And I call the Treasurer.
Thank you, Speaker. I move that the bill be now read a second time. And on this Ngunnawal land, I acknowledge all of the First Nations people of this country and the custodians, customs and cultures which guide and inspire us. Mr Speaker, this is a budget for the here and now, and it's a budget for the decades to come. It's a responsible budget that helps people under pressure today and invests in the promise and potential of the more prosperous future that we can make together. Our main priorities are helping with the cost of living, building more homes for Australians, investing in a future made in Australia and the skills and universities we'll need to make it a reality, strengthening Medicare and the care economy, and responsible economic management which is set to produce another surplus and help fight inflation. Speaker, this government and this budget delivers for every Australian. A tax cut for every taxpayer, wages growing in every industry, a better deal for every working parent, a fairer go at every checkout, new help with energy bills for every household and for small business, stronger Medicare in every community, more homes in every state and territory, more opportunities in every TAFE and university, a dignified retirement for older Australians, energy and industry policies that help bring the jobs of the future to every corner of our country, an economic plan where growth and opportunity go together, a government and a budget for every Australian. This budget is framed in fraught and fragile global conditions. The world economy is resilient in parts but subdued overall. Inflation is lingering in North America. Growth is slowing in China and tepid in Europe. Tensions have escalated in the Middle East and they persist in Ukraine. Global supply chains are fragmenting. This uncertainty combines with cost of living pressures and higher interest rates to slow our economy, with growth forecast to be just 1.75% this financial year and 2% next. Slower growth means a softer labour market, with unemployment expected to rise slightly to 4.5% next year, even as we create tens of thousands of new jobs. I want Australians to know that despite everything coming at us, we are among the best placed economies to manage these uncertainties and maximise our opportunities. We have an envied combination of moderating inflation, record new jobs, near record participation, real wages growth, the lowest ever gender pay gap and expanding business investment. Annual inflation has more than halved from its peak in 2022 and it's now lower than anticipated in the mid-year update. But we know that people are still under the pump. That's why we designed our cost of living policies to ease these pressures and take another 0.75 of a percentage point off inflation this year and 0.5 percentage point next year. Treasury is now forecasting that inflation could return to target earlier, perhaps even by the end of this year. At the same time, around 780,000 jobs have been created under this government, a record for any first term. This is stronger jobs growth than in any major advanced economy. Real wages are growing again for the first time in almost 3 years. Business investment is now expected to record its longest annual expansion since the mining boom. And we're addressing the pressures caused by population growth, with net overseas migration next year now expected to be half what it was last year. Speaker, the number one priority of this government and this budget is helping Australians with the cost of living. Responsible relief that eases pressure on people and directly reduces inflation. The comprehensive cost of living plan in this budget delivers a tax cut for every taxpayer, provides new power bill relief for people and small businesses. It freezes the cost of medicines. It makes student loans fairer. It boosts competition in our economy so families and farmers get a fairer deal. And it supports renters as well. Our new tax cuts for Middle Australia are the biggest part of the cost of living relief in this budget. From July 1, all 13.6 million taxpayers will get a tax cut. And for 84% of taxpayers and 90% of tax-paying women, a bigger tax cut than they would have under the previous government. This is about rewarding the hard work of our nurses and teachers and truckies and tradies, and the 2.9 million people earning $45,000 a year or less who would have received nothing. The average benefit is $1,888 a year, which is $36 a week. Our tax cuts are better for families and communities, women and young people. They are better for business and they are better for the economy. Speaker, in 2022, Russia's invasion of Ukraine triggered the biggest shock to global energy prices since the 1970s. We know Australian families and businesses have felt this pain, and that's why we've stepped in to help. Electricity prices would have risen 15% in the last year, if not for our efforts. Instead, they rose an average of 2%. And tonight, I assure Australians that more help is on the way. This budget delivers $3.5 billion in new energy bill relief for everyone. Just as every Australian taxpayer will get a tax cut, every Australian household will get energy price relief. From July 1, Australians will receive an energy rebate of $300 and 1 million small businesses will get a little bit more. The ABS has shown how cutting energy bills directly cuts inflation too, keeping the lights on for families and businesses and keeping downward pressure on inflation. Mr Speaker, Labor governments make Medicare stronger and we make medicines cheaper. We're providing up to $3 billion for cheaper medicines and the community pharmacies that distribute them. And we are freezing the maximum cost of PBS prescriptions for everyone. This year and next year, no one will pay more than $31.60. But 6 out of 10 PBS scripts go to pensioners and concession card holders. And we will freeze the cost of their medicines for 5 years, meaning no pensioner, no concession card holder will pay more than $7.70 for the medicine that they need. We're also investing $3.4 billion to add life-changing and life-saving medicines to the PBS, cutting the cost of one breast cancer treatment from around $100,000 to $31.60. Mr Speaker, going to university can be a life-changing opportunity. For 35 years now, our student loan system has supported millions of people who study hard to chase their dream. But spikes in inflation have exposed a flaw in this system and put young people under unfair pressure. We are fixing that and we're changing that so that it won't happen again. We're capping indexation of student loans to either the consumer price index or the wage price index, whichever is lower. And backdating it to the middle of 2023 will cut indexation from last year in half. It will wipe $3 billion in student debt for over 3 million Australians and save the average person around $1,200. Speaker, we know that Australians are feeling the pinch at the checkout. That's why we empowered the competition watchdog to hold supermarkets accountable. That's why we're taking steps to make the food and grocery code mandatory and making our economy more competitive across the board by strengthening the mergers regime and abolishing nuisance tariffs and reducing compliance costs for business. Because more competition means more choices, it means lower prices and better services and better jobs. Now, rising rents, Mr Speaker, are another big part of the inflation challenge, and we're supporting renters who need our help. We are providing $1.9 billion to increase the maximum rates of Commonwealth rent assistance by a further 10%. This is on top of the 15% increase delivered in our last budget. It's the first back-to-back increase to Commonwealth rent assistance in more than 30 years, and more much-needed help for young people and for renters of all ages doing it tough. So we're easing the cost of living and we are building more homes for Australians. In the 5 years from this July, we aim to build 1.2 million of them. Our goal is ambitious, but it's achievable if we all work together and if we all do our bit. $6.2 billion in new investments mean our $32 billion Homes for Australia plan will clear local infrastructure bottlenecks, provide more housing for students, fund more social and affordable housing, and we'll also deliver better transport for better access to suburbs and cities and regions. Mr Speaker, more homes means more affordable homes and a better deal for buyers, builders and renters alike. The current housing pipeline is backed up. We've already allocated $3.5 billion to address bottlenecks and to slash red tape. And this budget includes another $1 billion to help states and territories build more housing sooner. And we're providing $89 million for 20,000 additional fee-free TAFE and vet and vocational places to train more construction workers to do the work that we will need. Yeah. Speaker, Australia's international education sector is a national asset, but for too long enrolments have grown without being matched by an increase in student housing supply. This puts pressure on prices and rents, especially in our cities and suburbs. It makes finding housing harder for everyone. We have a more substantial and a more sustainable approach. If universities want to take more international students, they must build more student accommodation. We will limit how many international students can be enrolled by each university based on a formula, including how much housing they build. So more student housing and more social housing. Tonight's budget delivers an additional $1.9 billion in loans to help build 40,000 social and affordable homes. We've also secured the National Housing Agreement, which would otherwise have run out. We're building more remote housing in the Northern Territory. We're doubling funding dedicated to addressing homelessness. And we're directing $1 billion towards accommodation for women and children fleeing domestic violence and for youth. Building new homes will mean building new connections to community as well, so people can find good jobs and count on reliable transport close to where they want to live. We're investing in vital projects to build new transport networks across every state and territory, including a new rail link that will bring the communities of the Sunshine Coast and Brisbane together, opening Western Sydney to the world with $2.3 billion for better infrastructure and the new international airport, and $102 million to upgrade regional airports and remote airstrips, better connecting remote communities to essential services. Mr Speaker, we're building more homes and we're helping people now. And we're also building an economy that will position our people to benefit from the opportunities of the decades ahead. The world is committed to net zero by 2050. This will demand the biggest transformation in the global economy since the Industrial Revolution. Australian energy can power it. Australian resources can build it. Australia's regions can drive it. Australian researchers can shape it. And Australian workers can thrive in it. Yeah. Our $22.7 billion Future Made in Australia package will help make us an indispensable part of the global net zero economy, a crucial part of a growth agenda which is all about attracting investment in key industries, making our country a renewable energy superpower, strengthening our defence capabilities and our economic security, supporting small business to grasp the opportunities of our transforming economy, and expanding and reforming tertiary education for a more skilled workforce. To realise the opportunities of a future made in Australia, we're changing the way that we attract and deploy investment in our economy. A new Act and a new framework will impose the rigour, focusing investment on transformational opportunities and setting conditions to ensure investors benefiting from our incentives are supporting their people and communities to lift private investment in skills and workers and workforces and local supply chains. We will create a front door for investors to accelerate and coordinate transformational projects, establish a domestic national interest account that adds discipline to investments in the national interest, and strengthen and streamline approvals across environmental, planning, cultural heritage and foreign investment. We know that the global energy transformation presents a golden opportunity for Australia. The world is changing and the pace of that change is accelerating. And our approach to growth and investment needs to change as well. If we hang back, the chance for a new generation of jobs and prosperity will pass us by, and our people will be poorer and our economy will be more vulnerable as a consequence. This budget invests in our renewable energy superpower ambitions, including $13.7 billion in production tax incentives for green hydrogen and processed critical minerals, so industries are rewarded for scale and success. The $1.7 billion Future Made in Australia Innovation Fund to develop new industries like green metals and low-carbon fuels, and $520 million to deepen net zero trade and engagement with our region. We're also allocating $566 million to map the geological potential of our entire country, to get a comprehensive picture of our critical minerals and our groundwater as well. Speaker, in a world of rapid economic change and heightened strategic competition, investing in modern defence industries serves our economic and national security interests. That's why we're injecting $50.3 billion over the decade to deliver the capabilities we need to keep Australians safe as part of the National Defence Strategy. We're also boosting economic resilience and strengthening our supply chains, giving Australian firms the chance to manufacture more of the next generation of solar panels, moving our nation along the critical minerals value chain through investing in battery production, and backing the Australian creators of the world's first commercial-scale quantum computer. In defence, in energy, in resources and right around our economy, we want Australian small businesses to share in the big opportunities ahead as well. That's why we're extending the $20,000 instant asset write-off until 30 June 2025, providing $290 million in cash flow support for up to 4 million small businesses, and investing $625 million to help farmers and rural communities reduce emissions and better prepare for climate change and drought. Speaker, to seize the transformative opportunities of a more modern economy, we will expand the opportunity and reach of tertiary education to more Australians in response to the Universities Accord. Because it shouldn't matter whether you live in the suburbs or the regions, whether your parents are rich or poor, whether you were born with disability or grew up with disadvantage, whether you're a First Nations Australian or a first-generation Australian. The chance and the choice to go to university or TAFE should not be out of reach. Tonight we are setting a national target of 8 out of 10 workers achieving a tertiary qualification by 2050, and we're backing it in with new funding reforms to meet this goal. We're investing $350 million for fee-free uni-ready courses. These courses give those who would have missed out on studying a degree a foot in the door. And we're paying students in critical sectors like nursing and teaching and social work to do the practical placements which are such an important part of their studies. Yeah. We're also investing $500 million in skills for priority industries like clean energy and construction and manufacturing, and supporting women to build careers in these fields. These landmark reforms will improve the quality, the affordability and the sustainability of the tertiary education system and drive lasting, transformative change for our students and for our economy. Mr. Speaker, one of the best and one of the most important things about our country is the way that we look out for each other and look after each other. Our health system and our care economy are central to this. That's why in this budget we are strengthening Medicare and mental health, delivering better, stronger aged care, making the NDIS fairer and more sustainable, and boosting wages in the care economy. The purpose and promise of Medicare is world-class healthcare every Australian can access and afford, and the foundation of that is bulk billing. bulk billing GPs in family medical centres and bulk billing consultations in our new Medicare urgent care clinics. Since June last year, almost 400,000 visits have been made to our 58 clinics in suburbs and regions all over Australia. Almost 1 in 3 visits have been for kids under 15. And because these clinics open early and they close late, more than 1 in 3 visits were outside normal working hours. In this budget, we're allocating $227 million for a further 29 Medicare urgent care clinics, taking pressure off emergency departments and making it easier for Australians to access free healthcare. Making Medicare stronger also means doing better on mental health. That's why we're investing $361 million to strengthen our mental health system, including new funding for a national digital mental health service that will provide free support to 150,000 Australians a year. Speaker, as more Australians live longer and healthier lives, demand for our aged care services is growing and the sort of care we need is changing. We will invest another $2.2 billion in aged care and we will implement more of the Royal Commission, including $1.2 billion to improve systems so our aged care services remain accessible, up-to-date and reliable. Ensuring dignity and security for older Australians means allowing people to choose the care that's right for them, including staying in their own home. And that's why we're investing $531 million for another 24,000 home care packages, giving more Australians that choice. Now, whether it's aged care or the National Disability Insurance Scheme, we will work with the community and across this parliament to fund the future services that people need and deserve. Over the last decade, the NDIS has delivered life-changing support for Australians with a disability. All of us in this place take pride in it, and all of us must take responsibility for securing its future. Working with National Cabinet to put participants at the centre of the scheme and design and fund additional foundational supports outside of it, and ensuring that every dollar invested in the NDIS goes to those who need it most, which is why we're providing $469 million to keep working with the disability community and the states and territories to crack down on fraud and exploitation. Speaker, this government is ensuring that Australians can earn more and keep more of what they earn in the care economy and in every industry. We will ensure that those who look after our kids and teach our kids as they learn and our parents as they age have the secure, well-paid jobs that they deserve. We will fund a further increase in award wages for our aged care workers, building on the $11.3 billion that we funded last year. And we have provision for a wage increase for childcare workers and early educators as well. This will help recruit and retain more early childhood educators, giving more Australian kids the best start that we can. Speaker, in childcare, in aged care and across the care economy, the majority of workers are women. Lifting wages in these industries has helped bring the gender pay gap to a historic low. Our government is the first in history with more than 50% women, and we are 100% committed to women's equality and opportunity and safety. Violence against women is a national shame and it requires our national action. We're delivering $925 million to establish the Permanent Leaving Violence program, which takes our total investment to address violence against women to $3.4 billion. But we know that there is more work for all of us to do. And we are very proud, Mr. Speaker, that this budget extends superannuation to parents on paid leave. When it comes to these first months of your child's life, you can't put a price on being there, and you shouldn't pay a price for being there. That's why we've provided $1.1 billion to pay super on government-funded parental leave. This will make the super system fairer, it will reduce the gender gap, and it will benefit 180,000 families a year. And we're providing another $56 million to improve access to women's health services and $19 million to support carers to better choose how and when they work. Mr. Speaker, we know that cost of living pressures fall heaviest on the most vulnerable. New energy rebates and more rent assistance will help. But we're also continuing the freeze on social security deeming rates until 30 June 2025, benefiting over 870,000 people, including 450,000 aged pensioners. For those who face additional barriers to finding work, we're providing $41 million to further extend eligibility for the existing higher rate of job seeker. So people who can only work up to 14 hours a week will see their payment increase at least $54.90 a fortnight. We will also make new investments in health and housing, education and jobs for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. As well as more remote housing, we're creating the new Remote Jobs and Economic Development Program, with 3,000 new jobs in remote Australia to build new skills and new confidence within communities. So, Mr. Speaker, from delivering a tax cut to every taxpayer to reducing student debt or helping renters, from new energy bill relief to the care economy to a future made in Australia, we are easing pressure on Australians while investing in our people, our economy and our future, at the same time as we strengthen the budget and pay down debt. Last year, our responsible economic management delivered the first surplus in 15 years. We now expect another surplus of $9.3 billion this year. Yeah. These would be the first back-to-back surpluses in almost 2 decades. But pressures on the budget intensify after that rather than ease. We're expecting a deficit of $28.3 billion in 24-25, but a stronger fiscal outcome in every year compared to when we came to government. Yeah. On our watch, the budget is $215 billion stronger over the 6 years to 2027-28. Gross debt is now expected to peak at 35.2% of our economy in 26-27 before declining to 30.2% by 2034-35. This year, gross debt will be $904 billion instead of the more than $1 trillion that we inherited. And that means debt is $152 billion lower. A stronger budget means we save around $80 billion in interest costs over the decade. These are the dividends of our responsible economic management. We found $27.9 billion in savings and reprioritisations in this budget and $77.4 billion since the election. We're limiting real spending growth to an average of 1.4% per year since we came to government. That's less than half the average of the last 30 years, and it's around a third of the growth under our predecessors. And we're banking 96% of revenue upgrades this year, keeping pressure off inflation while it's still above the band, with Treasury now expecting we could get back to the inflation target this year, not next. That means inflation is expected to be lower sooner. And we've achieved all of this despite much smaller revenue upgrades in the budget and still providing an extra $3 billion to ensure Australians, including our veterans, receive better essential services. So, Mr. Speaker, the story of Australia is more than a tale of the challenges that we have endured. And in our future, we need to strive for something more than muddling through or making do. This budget shows that we are realistic about the pressures that people face right now, and we are optimistic about the future. This budget reflects our biggest ambitions and our highest aspirations to make Australians the primary beneficiaries of a world of churn and change, tapping their confidence, their compassion, their creativity to manage their pressures and maximise our advantages, to forge a new economy and a new generation of prosperity. And in that effort, to make Australians and Australia more secure in the bigger opportunities that we shape and in the future that we make together. And that's why I commend this bill, Mr. Speaker, and this budget to the House.
Good and bad news in that. I suppose the good news is that there weren't really any surprises. I mean, we talked a little bit off air beforehand that this is probably the most sort of leaked budget that we've had. I want to focus on the housing stuff first. So obviously there's been some announcements in and around social housing. Any takeaways from you guys while I go and turn off the second computer that's blasting in my ear? I'll start with you, Cate, for housing. I mean, the cost of living pressure was something that was talked about a fair bit. I mean, Pete's drinking game was obviously a real success as well. But it does kind of seem like a little bit of a drop in the ocean with the announcement of the social housing stuff that they're going to do.
Yeah, 40,000 compared to 1.2 million. That's just over 3%. Something that I did note that came up towards the end was around rental assistance and just how much money has gone into supporting renters, and it's quite significant. And to Pete's point, I wonder what the impact will be and whether there'll be an unintended consequence in relation to trying to curb the rate of inflation, and in particular in the housing segment. That noise is so annoying. Pete, what were your thoughts on the rental subsidy in particular?
Yeah, so there wasn't a whole lot. So there's a whole section of the budget there that they've called Building More Homes for Australians. So new housing investment in the budget, but a lot of it's doubling up. $1 billion to states to deliver new housing. So that's things like sewerage and roads. The rent assistance is probably the biggest bit. Also, I don't know if you caught it there, but Chalmers was saying that they're going to force the universities to provide more student accommodation, because that's obviously been one of the choke points over the past year or 18 months. As the students have come back, they've really sort of put pressure on the rental stock. So more student accommodation, and they're going to cap international student numbers. But actually, there wasn't a whole lot in here, really. A lot of the focus was on the infrastructure, more transport, accessibility to suburbs. There's a lot of sort of double counting of numbers about government investment in affordable and social housing. And yes, more help for renters. So a couple of billion for the Commonwealth Rent Assistance. So, yeah, but look, it's not huge. There's not really much in it. When you actually think about the previous announcements about 1.2 million homes in 5 years, well, yeah, they haven't really done a whole lot there. There's nothing really new, put it that way.
What was interesting, and I caught it in some notes, was the building and repair of social housing. And we haven't had much dialogue. I haven't read anything about the repair of social housing. But what I do know from just being on the ground and seeing areas where social housing has been abandoned, is we own a lot of assets that aren't being inhabited. And, if we've got uninhabitable assets that could do with a repair, surely that budget could stretch a lot further, and I think that would be really interesting to delve into, but it only got a slight mention.
Yeah, it's been happening a little bit in Queensland. The state government has been actually acquiring disused hotels or old social housing and bringing it back to the market, it needs to be done. I think the problem, I guess, down your way, Cate, is obviously the state budget is in an absolute mess in Victoria, and there's not much being made available for that sort of thing. So, yeah, there's a lot of pressures there, and the government's sort of promising to build more homes sooner. But I think the reality is the market is going to have to deliver most of it, and the government contribution for social and affordable housing in the context of some very big population growth numbers, it's a drop in the ocean, really. Interesting to see they did sort of cut the forecast for net overseas migration over the next year or two. But as people have pointed out, you can more or less take it with a grain of salt, because last year's forecast and the one before that was so far out that it's a bit like, well, what's the point in the forecast? If you can't get it to the nearest 100,000, then you may as well not bother. So, yeah, it'd be interesting to see whether they can actually cut back immigration to more normal levels.
It was interesting. I noticed Jeremy taking the credit for what is essentially a surprise on the upside with commodity prices, but calling that sort of sensible financial management. And obviously that's something that we hear a little bit more from the Liberals singing from their hymn book as being, the gold standard in economic managers. And you could just see Chalmers' face really light up when he was talking about it's been nearly 2 decades since we've had back-to-back budget surpluses. But then of course predicting a huge deficit for next year. Is that kind of a little bit of the political spin that we're seeing point to the next election?
Yeah, well, it's always been that way, right? Someone spends it and leaves the problem for the next person to clean. So I think, $28 billion deficit following the year is them probably predicting a much lesser amount of the tickets, obviously, that they've been receiving, and the clips along the way. But yeah, I think he's now put about, Pete and Cate, probably about 16, 17 billion surplus over the last 2 years to negate that in 1 year with a $28 billion deficit. It just kind of crept in and washed away quite quickly, to then emphasise two decades of obviously back-to-back surpluses. So it speaks volumes. It speaks volumes, saying that we've had 2 really great years post-COVID, a lot of great revenue that we've received, but there probably might be some worry in times ahead. But it wasn't as big. The splash on infrastructure was probably less than I thought. I thought it was actually going to be a lot more. Very concentrated. They focused on the southwestern suburbs of Sydney, having quite a big fair amount of money going towards that Badgerys Creek corridor where the new airport is. But for the other states, to be very fair, I think you guys didn't get a fair amount of money that probably you have needed for a long time. And it was good to see Northern Territories getting quite a bit of cash being thrown at them to help rejuvenate their remote areas and bring people and connect people more to the central city of Darwin.
Yeah, it was interesting to see, wasn't it, Mike? If you look at the aggregates there, government payments as a percentage of GDP, in 2023, 24%, 2024, 25%, and the next couple of years, 26%, 27%. So net debt, which was projected to go down, is actually now going to rise next year, the year after, the year after, the year after. That's not really responsible economic management. It's a bit BS to claim otherwise, really. So I guess the whole point of the budget, as we said at the outset, is to reduce inflation. So the energy price relief and the Commonwealth rent assistance, they're saying that'll take 0.75 of a percentage point off inflation. So that gets them down to below 3%. But look at the cost of it. The power price discounts, $300 for every household, $325 for every small business, no means testing. Everybody gets the car, as we said at the start there. And that's on top of the state discount. So we get $1,000 in Queensland, WA gets $400. So even in just 1 year, there's $3.5 billion there just showered out for reducing inflation. So yeah, it's a bit it's political spin really to claim that it's sensible economic management because payments are actually going up.
Yeah, exactly. I think that was a little bit kind of cheeky there, but they all like to give themselves a bit of a pat on the back for that. Kate, just looking at the budget papers live here at the moment, under Building More Homes for Australians, there's a subheading of help to build, rent and buy. Now, we've got Commonwealth rent assistance, but that doesn't apply to a huge cohort of the country. Build, yes, we've talked a lot about it. But in terms of help to buy, I can't see anything that's targeted to people, first home buyers or those looking to purchase an owner-occupied property. They seem to be left out of this.
Yeah, look, and it's fair to say you'll see your news headlines, and there was one that broke in Melbourne on the weekend about the time that it takes for a young person starting out to save a 20% deposit. The reality is, I think that we've extinguished a lot of the chatter about first home buyer woes with some of these initiatives. I just think we need more of them. And a lot of people are a bit disparaging about the shared equity schemes, but I think the deposit guarantee is a ripper. And the number of people that I've seen benefit from that 5% down and no LMI has been astonishing. And of course, we've got stamp duty breaks for various price points across the states and territories. I think the reality is that there'll always be a cry out for the plight of the first home buyer. But when we have a look at the credit numbers at the moment, they're not doing too bad. They're representing a decent amount of new lending, and it's been a slightly increasing number of late. So I think that, where there's no jungle drums beating, you won't hear them talking about it on budget night.
Jeremy?
I was going to say, I definitely feel like the government has thrown their hands up and said, we have done everything we possibly can. We've given you every incentive we possibly have available to us. How much can we continue to give you at the sacrifice of other things like NDS taking another $5 billion and infrastructure. So it'll be, you're right, it was definitely not a favourable budget as we've seen in the last couple of years addressing first home buyers getting into the market. It's kind of saying we've done what we can now, we'll leave it to the states, and it's up to you guys to make the decisions and how you want to do it.
But likewise, at the other end of the spectrum, we didn't hear anything about retirees, and they certainly didn't touch on super, which would have made you feel pleased, Jeremy.
I was happy. Then I think reform-wise, very, very mundane, as I mentioned earlier. I thought it would be. I don't think they want to rock the boat too much because the RBA is that big angry lion in the corner, ready to pounce if there is a reaction to the government and spending. So I don't know, Pete. I'm going to go out on a limb. I'm not strong at economics as you are, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say the RBA is sitting back. The board of directors tonight are sitting back saying, we're happy with that. You haven't pushed the buttons too much, and we can get on with our job now, which is moderating inflation in this country.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could always say, look at what market reaction. There was a small increase in the Aussie dollar, basically back to where it was this morning. I don't think bond yields will be moved. To be honest, I would actually think that the US producer price that figures out tonight will have more impact on the outlook for interest rates than anything that happened in the budget. It was pretty much as expected. And as Mike said, almost everything was leaked ahead of time anyway. So, it's... I think it's pretty much as you were, but there was no big announcements on housing or anything that's going to change course there. So, just lots of power price discounts and some rental assistance as well. So but overall, pretty much as expected, I think.
So when you kind of look at it as a whole, and of course I did miss a little bit of it running around trying to fix our dodgy audio system, but it seems like they gave enough away to sort of show that we are addressing some cost of living, but really in terms of the Commonwealth rent assistance, it's not impacting a huge cohort of renters. It doesn't seem like there's a huge amount of relief. Do you think they're really kind of pitching their election push all on interest rates dropping between now and the next federal election?
Yeah, definitely. I think if you actually think about a year or 18 months ago, Labour would have been miles ahead in the polls. They were comfortably expecting to get at least 2 terms and probably 3. The polling has been bad for various reasons, immigration being one of them, cost of living crisis being another. So this feels much more like an election budget. There's a lot being staked here on interest rates coming down before the next election, or at least being expected to. Financial markets weren't pricing a cut until June 2025. I don't know that this is actually going to change too much. So, but you can see what Labour's hoping for, and that is for inflation to get back to below 3% and the Reserve Bank being comfortable enough to ease interest rates. But whether or not it happens, there's so much stuff that's outside of Australia's control, of course. Fuel prices and all the other sort of inputs, things like copper prices have shot up recently. So there's a lot that can happen.
Cate, we've got a comment here from Luke Moroney saying rents up. Rents are already kind of rising. At the very least, there's nothing in there to take the pressure off other than some assistance for a small cohort of people. Is this a missed opportunity to perhaps speak to investor participation in the private rental market that we've actually seen? I don't know that they want to kick that.
Yeah, I think they want to kick that bear. It's a really tough one right now, and until they've got complete support with some of their initiatives, and I'm talking about the war that's waged with the Greens as well. Rental distress is such a hot topic, and it's hurting so many people. I think they conveniently wrapped it all up and called it basically the crisis that we're dealing with as a result of inflation and housing pressures, and they were very good at tiptoeing around that. But I also think we've got to remember that when it comes to rents and rent reforms, that's a state and territory based initiatives, and the federal government is very good at distancing themselves from the mess that some of the states and territories cause.
And I guess if we look at, the help to rent and help to build and buy, I guess it's the building stuff where they're really trying to move the needle. Government's total new investment since 2022 is to 32 billion. Obviously, there's $1 billion for new infrastructure in terms of services, power, water, sewerage, and that sort of stuff. The help for renters really is just the Commonwealth rent assistance. Housing for students is an interesting one that Pete talked about. That can take some pressure off that sort of quite niche market where we're talking about those small, 1-2 bedroom apartments there. But, one thing that I think is positive is the fee-free TAFE places. We do need to invest into the construction sector. Infrastructure, we talked about that beforehand. And then it comes down to a couple of the different regions. Jeremy, you mentioned Western Sydney. We've got Southeast Queensland infrastructure, connections for regional or remote communities, but we're only talking, $101 million. I mean, they were talking about $78 million for a research paper on whether the rail line from Sydney to Newcastle is going to work. Is there anything that, Chalmers reiterated their plan to build that 1.2 million homes. They're sticking to it. They think they can do it. Is there anything that you saw, Jeremy, that makes it easier? Any of the investment in making it easier for developers to get these properties up?
Yeah, it definitely. I'm going to mention this about. We touched upon it, but it is actually this: the allowing of foreign investors to purchase established build-to-rent developments. I know Pete mentioned it before, but Foreign Investment Review Board has been such a strict regulatory authority that allows overseas investors to only purchase very certain properties, brand new in nature, opening up more properties which are under the build to rent scheme, which gives foreign investors an opportunity to buy and then rent those out. That helps because they're forced to rent it. A lot of the wealthy overseas investors, they buy and they lock it up. The lights are off at night, so this is going to give people an opportunity to invest in Australia, but force them to provide rental accommodation and rooms, which could provide some supply in the market, maybe reducing and providing some relief to rent as well. So we'll be keen to see how they package that up, if it's full of more red tape and again bureaucracy, or if it's something that is accessible and encourages foreign investors to buy property and actually rent it out. It's not being subject to scrutiny of Foreign Investment Review Board.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think anecdotally many developers have said that the projects aren't stacking like they used to because a lot of that investment stock, the brand new apartment, for example, in the high density stuff was purchased by overseas investors, and it's been a very, very difficult time for them. So this potentially opens up that ability to create some new supply. We've got a question from Andy Reid. The key takeaways for the property sector. We'll go around the clockwise thing again. Cate, what if any, is probably a better way to preface.
There's a lot, actually. I think we've got to distill a lot of little points here and try and work out how our trends could be slightly adjusted. I think the big ones were in it over the last 12 months. There really wasn't a lot more that was said today. I think as I said, they've dusted the rental crisis under the carpet a little bit. And, I look at all of the pledges that they've made and all of the costings that they talked about with housing, and I was adding it all up. And then I look at defence and go, $50-something billion, it certainly puts it into context. A tiny point that I'll cover off that we haven't mentioned yet is in relation to first home buyer participation, maybe median age of first home buyers getting into the market, because we all know that that's been climbing, and I think it currently sits at 34. And it's moved a decade in age over about 15 or 16 years, I believe. But we're looking at HECS being reduced. That will in turn impact borrowing capacity for those who are working, and we can look at the amount of HECS and argue that it's a tiny drop in the ocean, but when you get to the pointy end with borrowing capacity, all of those extra little bits certainly make a bit of a difference. We're also looking at paying our nurses and teachers and social workers for their training during during their on-the-job placements, and apprentices in the clean energy sector are looking at getting a payment of around $10,000. And while these aren't enough to go out and buy a property, collectively, we might see first home buyers getting a little bit more of a break, and we might see the median age come down a little bit. But Andy, in answer to your question, key takeaways, not much to see here, folks, is what I would have said.
And Pete, anything that speaks to housing, property sector outside of some of these regional infrastructure increases and this big basically $10 billion a year extra for the next 5 years in defence, do you think that's likely to feed into property in those locations?
Yeah, not a lot. G'day, Andy. Good to see you. I'm actually going to Matlock in August. You'll be pleased to hear. Yeah, look, what was there was 10% increase for rent assistance, so that sort of helps 1 million households at the lower income end. Most of the stuff was really infrastructure investment, Western Sydney, Sunshine Coast Rail, that kind of thing. A little bit of investment in social and affordable housing, tiny amounts really, but for agreements on social housing, homelessness. But the only thing I can really see that changes the dynamic a little bit is just on if they're going to force more student accommodation, force universities to get involved and actually help deliver that and cap student numbers in the meantime. But yeah, there's nothing, it's actually surprisingly little given the urgency of the rental crisis. There's very little in this budget that's new.
And it begs the question, Jeremy, with Commonwealth rent assistance, essentially that's just made it easier for some people to wear the increase in rents. It's kind of a little bit like first home buyer grants that tend to be sort of inflationary, right? It just means that these rents are going to be a little bit more palatable for the lower end of town, but nothing in it to really take pressure off rents apart from, foreign investment in build to rent. Is that your read on it?
Yeah, that's my read. And I think one of the other big key takeaways is that it's definitely not an adding to the inflation. It's not an inflationary budget. That's one of the big things they wanted to stress. We are not going to work against the RBA. So I think we can quite confidently say that rates aren't going to jack up very much like the CFO, CEO of Judo said the other day, although there is the opportunity, depending on what happens in the US, that we may need to follow to keep our currency and dollar more buoyant. But definitely I can see that the Labor government didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater and throw money around where they could have in a surplus budget. So I think that's positive. It gives us as interest rate payers and borrowers just a little bit more peaceful sleep at night, knowing that rates aren't going to jack up very quickly now. We can probably see a little bit more of an extension and a hold as opposed to sharp increases to come.
If I remember correctly, I reckon you felt that they were quite sensible this time last year, Jeremy.
Yeah, he's lucky because he's got plenty of money at the moment, Jim Chalmers, to play with. But I think he's probably got a bit of a clip on the back of the head, probably a couple of the power brokers there. They do want to win another term, and they've got to shake the Labor government tag of being not the economic party. So I think he's trying to break that stigmatism of being not an economical, astute person and work his backside off to win the voters of the people with a bit more economic understanding and financial literacy. So yeah, it's mundane. Two mundane budgets, guys. Oh, God, I'd have to go to Coffs Harbour with Pete next time.
Wouldn't it be great if my technical issues actually caused a problem? When nothing is discussed, it's actually kind of mitigates that issue there. But again, I do apologise. Once we put this back on, we'll edit that and slide it in a nice little package for everybody. I want to put it out to anyone that's listening or watching live. We have a few people on with us at the moment. If you've got any questions for the panel before we wrap up, get them through now while you still can. Pete, give us a bit of an insight into the economic situation. Does the outlook for the Australian economy look pretty dire in the next little while?
If you look at the forecast for GDP, they're pretty weak. So, yeah, the outlook is really for a slowing economy and per capita terms, quite significantly so. I mean, we kind of knew that anyway, but yeah, I guess Treasury is expecting GDP growth basically to show about 2% growth, and that's lower than what it was previously forecasting at 2.25%. And for 2025-6 financial year, growth of 2.25%, down from 2.5%. So yeah, it's pretty slow. I guess that's that's just the flip side of the rapid rebound we had from COVID. So it's households are feeling the pressure, but there's no free lunches. I think a lot of people thought that we could just shut down the global economy for a year or two with no comeback, and it's like, well, first rule of economics, no free lunches. So the rapid sort of inflation and now the pain that households are having to take. It was interesting, actually. Jeremy made a really good point there. Official inflation is 3.6%, and at one point it got to nearly 8%. But it's like that's the consumer price index. But there's a whole load of stuff in there where prices haven't increased as much. But if you went back to 2020, since then we'd be paying at least 50% more for inflation. Eating out, I don't know about you guys, but it's costing me 50% more, and I don't think I'm eating more. Cost of building a home is up 50%. So, yeah, like from a housing perspective, inflation has absolutely rocketed over the last 4 years. So, yeah, consumer prices is one thing, but yeah, the lived experience is the modern buzzword. Inflation's been high, and it's put loads of pressure on, as Mike said before. A lot of development and construction firms have been going bust at decade highs, and that's really where the difficulty comes in supplying all the new housing that's needed.
And it begs the question, and a great question from Luke, what happens at the next election? Is the rental crisis at the top of the agenda or anything else? It kind of seems like there's really nothing in this to take that fire under the backside of rents away. I mean, I remember rents being flat for basically a decade, and Peter Kalisos, the property professor, modelling it out, saying that rents haven't kept pace with inflation over like a quarter of a decade period. It's just the rapid pace of change that's likely to happen. With your contrarian views, do you see an increase in supply that's going to hopefully get these rents down at a point where we're not going to have some knee-jerk policies that have unintended consequences?
Was that question for me? Well, yeah. In fact, look, you can already see it. Like if you look at the asking rents for the last month, 0.5% increase. So, yeah, I mean, one of the lessons that people should have taken away from COVID is that we have this kind of static view of the housing market. A lot of people do, and it's like every 2.5 extra persons we've got in the population, we need one extra dwelling. But that's not really how the real world works. You've got household formation. We saw during COVID, there were people buying holiday homes on the coast, and then people didn't want to be in those inner city apartments because they couldn't use the lifts and the facilities, and there was a big shift outwards. And that's how the market works in the real world. And basically what's going to happen, and we're seeing it already on the Sunshine Coast and probably in other parts of the country, is that when people are charging $3,000 a week for rent, people just go, well, fine, I'll do something different. I'll buddy up. I'll stay with parents for longer. So I think the market will actually see rents tapering off, even though there might still be a shortage overall. I don't think we'll continue to see rents rocketing. I think eventually things will start to level off, and it's starting to happen already, arguably. If you look at SQM's figures that released today, it looks like asking rents are just cooling a bit. So, yeah, we'll see what happens. But, yeah, markets have a way of sorting themselves out over time, and I think eventually things will cool.
And, Cate, is that your hope, is that the markets sort themselves out rather than politicians try and solve the problem? Because we've seen some very interesting intervention from the state politicians in and around housing. And your particular state has probably got the gold medal for the worst policy to reduce pressure on rents.
Yeah, look, I love Pete's contrarian outlook. I actually don't subscribe to it. I still think that our rents are still climbing. It's just that our rate of increase has slowed down. If you have a look at at the core logic data, you can see that we're all still, close to double digit, if not into it, for rental price growth, and that's outstripping property price growth. But in Melbourne, it's amplified because we haven't had the same price growth as other capital cities, yet we've had more investor-led sales. We've taken out the gong for the percentage of sales that are investors selling their properties. And so I think that our rental crisis down here is not going to get better for a little while. And it's like steering a ship, trying to turn it around. It takes a long time. So in answer to that last question about, what will we hear about rents in the election, we absolutely will. We can bank on certainly the Greens and probably the Liberal Party making a song and dance about the fact that the rental crisis is all the fault of the Labor government, because it's convenient to do that. But I think that we will need to shine a spotlight on the various reforms and the differences between the states and the territories. Dare I say it, there might be an effort to try and consolidate some of those differences and have it a little bit more evenly spread across the nation in regards to how we approach rules around rents. But I don't know, maybe it's very wishful thinking, because we've certainly made a mess of it down here in Victoria.
I'll give you a little bit of a heads up. We'll wrap up in a second, and I want to see if I can get a one-sentence overview from each of you rating the budget. Before I do that, Jeremy, we're sort of taught not to talk about the property market, but it sort of seems like one of those appropriate times where we sort of can a little bit, because everything's going up, rents are going up pretty much everywhere, although Brian sort of cautions us to understand that, well, rents have actually dropped in some areas. But interestingly, our realestate.com, who own flatmates.com.au, apparently have gone through a bit of a rebrand to talk about a new cohort that are looking for flatmates, and that's often middle-aged women who obviously are one of the growing stats in homelessness. That's the sort of seriousness that we have here. It makes me kind of worry about what's likely to be the intervention before the market can settle itself out. Is that something that you're thinking about?
Yeah, I'll probably go back to markets need to correct themselves. We've had too much political interference for such a long time now, 3, 4, 5 years, huge amount of capital being thrown left, right and centre. COVID was an opportunity for the market to do a little bit of a reset and kind of smooth things off from a very overheated market post the GFC. A lot of capital came into the market. I think what Labor's tried to do is tried to give themselves every opportunity not to put more fuel on the fire and stem more growth, because they will lose an election. If the market does take off again substantially and rates go out of control and inflation increases, forget it. They've got no chance of the next election. They've given themselves, I think openly, they've given themselves an opportunity to be at the race and be in line with Liberal and the coalition at the next election. I think Chalmers has delivered something which I would say to be very proud of, but not a lot of economic reform to say it's going to make a lot of changes in the market. Mike, I could probably dare say we'll keep bubbling along the way that we are. Prices will still continue to increase and rents will probably still continue to float up. Very much what, like Cate said, I agree with your comment. The increase will slow, but the increase will still be there.
And Cate, I'm going to go to you first for your review of Chalmers' budget. We've got a comment from Luke as well. Labor to incentivise investors. I don't think any political persuasion has got the gumption to incentivise investing, despite it being probably the easiest way to move the needle on the tight rental market. It's just political hot potato that we've never seen anyone want to touch. In fact, the opposite. But give us your take of the budget.
Well, look, there was a lot of talk about health and education, which we all would have to agree it needs a lot of attention. But when I added up the expenditure, it's still a drop in the ocean when we look at the really big ticket items. And they sort of glossed over defence, talked about our safety, but that's a hell of a spend, and it's an increased spend. That was the big standout for me.
Jeremy, give us your scathing review of the budget. You're normally not afraid to get onto the front foot.
He's calculative. I think it's a very calculative budget. He delivered something that is more mainstream, and I think that's probably the best word I can say. It's a very mainstream budget without rocking the boat too much in either direction. But we'll see if it wins him another term in party, in seat and in power.
We'll see indeed. And Pete, wrap us up for budget 2024.
Well, yeah, maybe not that surprising. A bit paternalistic, quite interventionist. Future made in Australia subsidies, lots of spending, but particularly the cost of living assistance is interesting. I don't think anyone has an issue with Commonwealth rent assistance so much because that's helping the most vulnerable. But energy discounts for everybody, not means tested. Oprah Winfrey, everyone gets a car. So, yeah, and this sets us up. There's a lot of spending, a decade of deficits ahead, which you would argue is pretty irresponsible, really, given the good fortune we've had.
That does seem like a missed opportunity to not means test those little handouts there. And I wonder, I want to pose a question to all of you. The Greens' reaction to this. I think there'll be some very relieved RBA board members after tonight. I think there's going to be some very strong rhetoric from the Greens in the morning. Should we expect the newspapers to light up with the missed opportunities that they're seeing for some of the policies that they've put forward and really have been digging their heels in against Labor, which has typically been a somewhat harmonious coalition?
I'm going to say it wouldn't be a budget without ruffling a couple of feathers from the Greens politicians, right? They've always got a problem, and they'll always will have a problem, whether it's not enough spending on green, green spending or green energy, to not providing enough capital for everyone to have a house and very much become an Oprah Winfrey moment that Pete's been saying. So I don't think it's a budget without a couple of Greens upset and angry.
All right. Well, what I will do is I will put a little link in the comments so you can get a copy of the budget speech, just because I know that you're not going to be able to sleep tonight unless you've got that. That's in the thread on Facebook and on the screen now. You can Google the federal budget. We did miss a little bit of the audio, but we'll fix that in post. But it's a very good evening, and thank you to my beautiful panel today, Pete Wargent, Cate Bakos, and Jeremy Iannuzzelli. Thank you very much. That was Budget 2024.
Thanks, Mike.
See you guys.